Welcome, and lovely to see so many people here. And just before we start, I should say Susie says there is a talk in the middle of August with people past, present and future of the Lifeboat, which is a paid ticket thing in the village hall. So if anyone wants to go to that, see Susie. And just to say that tomorrow morning we have the local authors book sale, hopefully on Friday and Saturday on the high street. So if anyone needs Christmas gifts, a little early maybe, but you never know. And we've got Andrew Sparrow tonight, so many thanks to Andrew for coming up from London to be with us tonight. He is a senior political correspondent with The Guardian and has the utterly impossible job of writing a live blog, which he'll tell us about, which involves updates every few minutes. He told me just on the walk over here that he likes to do considered journalism and leaves it 5 minutes before he files. So he's got time to gather his thoughts, while Twitter, of course, does it instantly. And he does that 5 times a week. It's an extremely demanding exercise, keeping on top of everything minute by minute for hours every day, 5 days a week. Started on the South Wales Echo, and was amazed to hear that it had 90,000 copies sold a day, which is probably what a national newspaper sells today on a Monday or a Tuesday. So the South Wales Echo used to have the same circulation as a national would today.
But it's gone down since I left.
Yes. And then the Mail and the Telegraph, and now the Guardian for 15, 16 years.
Yeah.
So he's going to tell us about political reporting and how that the media affects the politics. I mean, I have to say, I actually teach this subject, so I'm very glad. I've been making notes and cribbing them all for my course. So thank you, and over to you.
I hope I pass. I never studied media studies or journalism, so Owen can tell me afterwards if I've got it all wrong. When he invited me, he asked what I'd like to talk about, and I said, well, I'm interested in the media. I wrote a book about parliamentary journalism a long time ago. I'm interested in politics, obviously, and we knew there was going to be an election this summer. Does that sound okay? Perfect. So Owen suggested, what about how political reporting affects the election? And that's a clever and a difficult title, because it involves, you can't really consider how the media has affected this election without going back and asking yourself, well, how does the media and how do newspapers affect politics generally? And so I'm going to start with that and then come to the general election and cover newspapers and bias and how social media has changed everything, and hopefully wrap it up in about 20 minutes, half an hour. The broad outline is that newspapers used to be considerably influential. Quite how influential we'll come on to. But that era is over, and social media has made things just a lot more complicated. But the first thing to point out is that talking about the influence of political journalists is unusual, because in most areas of journalism, journalists don't consider themselves to be particularly influential at all. You don't have sports reporters who go around saying, my team won because of the great report I wrote, or the England failed in the Euros because of how they were reported. Court reporters don't see themselves as trying to influence the outcome of the court case. Reviewers, concert reviewers, theatre reviewers, they don't try and take credit for the performances. Even in business reporting, arguably business reporters can influence share prices and companies, but if they start doing that, they're probably in legally difficult territory. If they start boasting about it, they might end up going to prison. So in most areas of journalism, stuff happens and people report it. Yet in politics is the only area where you'll find journalists actively kind of boasting about how much influence they got. And there is no adjective a political journalist would be more keen to have attached to them than influential. And yet this is problematic if you sign up to the democratic model of journalism, which is the theory that in a democracy, there is no more important role for journalists than presenting fair and accurate and clear and comprehensive information about the political parties and political leaders. And the theory goes it's the job of journalists to present that information, and then voters will make a sensible, rational decision about who they should have leading them after the general election. That is, and that's a theory that most journalists who see themselves as doing a public interest journalism, which would definitely cover me and all my colleagues at The Guardian. It would cover people like kind of Owen and Barbara who've worked for the BBC, cover some of the most serious journalists, cover pretty much all local newspaper journalists too. That's what gets us up in the morning and makes us think we're doing something worthwhile and not just part of the entertainment industry. The problem with that democratic model is both bits of it are flawed. It's not much of the political information that people consume isn't necessarily sort of fair or accurate or balanced. The second half of the equation is problematic too, because there's quite a lot of evidence that presented with information, voters don't necessarily make very good choices anyway. And you can look at Donald Trump in the United States and probably build a case on that. But we'll kind of leave that side of the argument for another talk. And instead I want to go back to the issue of fairness and whether newspapers historically have done a good job of fairly presenting information to readers and to voters. And I'm going to go back to 1992, partly because that was the first election I ever covered when I was on the South Wales Echo. And Neil Kinnock was just about in our patch as a local MP, so I wasn't getting to do the national politics, but he would sort of come down to Cardiff and cover events. And I can't remember very much of what he said, but I have a very vivid memory of how the campaign changed. And he came down soon after it started and did a visit in St Athens, and there were a couple of local policemen there, and it was no big deal. And then on the night before polling day, he was in Islwyn, his constituency, and doing a rally in the evening. And by that stage, there were 3 special branch cars escorting him and escorts, and the police, which means the kind of state and the government, had clearly decided this guy was the next prime minister and he should be treated as the next. And that's what his team thought, and that's what the voters thought. That was also and then the next day the election came along, and the Sun newspaper published a kind of famous front page with Neil Kinnock's head inside a light bulb, and when the last person to leave the country sort of turn out the lights if Neil Kinnock is elected. No one particularly paid much attention to that, as I remember, because the polls showed Labour with not a big lead, but a substantial lead, and we expected him to win, and clearly he didn't. And then the next day, the Sun published another headline saying it was the Sun what won it, which is the kind of most famous quote in this whole argument about what influence newspapers have. And the convention, and it does beg the question, for the last 150 years, Britain has mostly elected Conservative governments, and has that been because we've generally had a Conservative press, or is it the other way round? Now, when that headline came out, the conventional wisdom amongst kind of journalists and academics who study this is that it wasn't the Sun that won it. Partly that was because people thought, well, you can't believe anything that's in the Sun headline anyway, and certainly not boasting like that, which is generally a good rule of thumb. Secondly, the Sun seemed to be arguing that because we ran this very strong front page the day before, that swung it at the last minute. And anyone who kind of knows anything about elections realises that endorsements don't sort of carry that much weight. And the only people who really take newspaper editorial endorsements very seriously, in my experience, tend to be the journalists who work for the newspapers, who need to know what their editors think. But in terms of having influence on readers, they don't very much. But the more general point is that newspapers can't brainwash people. They can't tell people what to think. They're very good at amplifying concerns. So if you're kind of worried about the levels of crime, or kind of how high immigration is, or fraud or anything like that, and newspapers keep telling you this is a really big problem, then you will it will become a bigger worry and concern to you than if you weren't reading stories every day saying kind of the world's coming to an end because of crime or immigrants or mobile phones or whatever. And critics will say, but the British public have been sort of brainwashed by these right-wing papers. I'm talking mostly in this context about bias in right-wing papers, not because I think unfair reporting by kind of left-wing papers doesn't matter, but simply because historically in the kind of 20th century there were more newspapers supporting the Conservative Party than there were newspapers supporting the Labour Party. So it has been if kind of bias is an issue, then there has always been more focus on the media helping the Conservatives rather than Labour. But the same principles apply. And the critics will argue, well, people have been perhaps brainwashed by these papers into Tory values. But if you look back at history, what are right-wing values? People like low taxes. Britons have liked low taxes centuries before newspapers even existed. And the Civil War was all about taxation. So the idea that this is, it's only newspapers that made people think like that is completely wrong. Sort of right-wingery is associated with support for tradition and the royal family. All of that is buried deep in English history, sort of long before people started publishing newspapers in the 18th century. Concern with one of the big criticisms of the right-wing papers, particularly Express and the Mail, is the way they present sort of immigrants as a kind of negative force, which is something they've been doing for 100 years. If you go back, it was particularly kind of black and Asian people. Now the racial element is toned down or more or less absent, but immigration is still a negative thing. But Britons have been kind of hostile and queasy about immigration kind of from time immemorial. And so all of these things are kind of deeply buried in the British psyche. And if the question is do Britons vote for right-wing parties because right-wing conservative papers are telling them to do so, or do we actually have conservative, is our press dominated by conservative newspapers because Britain is essentially basically quite a conservative place? Then the answer is it's 80%. It's probably it's much more the latter than the former. It's probably 80%. It would be my kind of estimate. Newspapers follow opinion much more than they lead opinion. That's the kind of consensus. That's my view. That's probably the consensus academic view. That's probably the consensus view in the industry. But there's a kind of proviso with that, which is that even if their influence is it's 28, even if it's 20-80%, which is a guess, not something I've proved, that 20% that's quite a lot. That matters. That's quite significant. And there are probably some elections where it may have made a difference. 1992, another reason why people look at 1992 is that was a very close election where no Conservative government had been elected for the fourth time in a row. And if a predominantly right-wing press was going to make a difference in any election, that might have been it. If you wanted to try and work out quite what influence papers have when they, week in, week out, present people with kind of slanted versions. And by slanted versions of news, I mean, I don't necessarily mean kind of making things up. I don't think newspapers do that generally very much. It's more to do with focusing constantly on issues that matter to one side and not the other, and then presenting news in emotive ways, which suggests that there are kind of goodies and baddies rather than black and white rather than grey. If you wanted to kind of test quite do newspapers have that influence? Then a good way to do that would be to find a control, some part of the country where they weren't reading these newspapers, and see if actually maybe that made a difference. And by a sort of happy coincidence, such an experiment has been happening for the last kind of few decades, courtesy of all ironies of the Sun itself. Because after Hillsborough and their famous front page on Hillsborough, when they basically accused the Hillsborough fan of kind of rioting and causing the crowd deaths, people in Liverpool just stopped buying the Sun completely, and to this day that boycott is largely enforced. If you go to Liverpool, it's quite hard to find lots of newsagents won't even sell it. Every time there's a Labour conference and the Labour leader does an interview with the Sun, there will still be complaints from Liverpool MPs that he's doing that. And a few years ago, some academics had the enterprising idea of saying, well, let's examine voting behaviour in Liverpool and Merseyside. They weren't looking at political voting, they were looking at Europe, and they were doing it in the context of the Brexit referendum. But they discovered that up till 1989, Merseyside and Liverpool, they were as Eurosceptic or more Eurosceptic than other parts of the UK. And the British Social Attitude Survey used to ask people every year their views on Europe. So there is good data on kind of what people in Liverpool felt. And they discovered that after 1989, when the sort of boycott set in, then Liverpool became a more pro-European place. And their thesis is, their figures were that so in the without the boycott of the Sun, they think on Merseyside would have voted 60-40 Leave, and in practice it voted 51-49 Remain. Now the academics who published this paper 5 years ago, they said their hypothesis was people either gave up reading the Sun completely, or they switched to reading the Daily Mirror, and therefore, if over a long period of time they were not being exposed to the Sun's Euroscepticism, that kind of probably made a difference. In other parts, they pointed out that in other parts of the country, if readers had boycotted the Sun, then they might have gone to the Daily Mail, so maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. But that's strong evidence that over time, prolonged exposure to a kind of slanted form of newspaper journalism will change the way, shift the way the population votes. So I don't think it was the Sun what won it in 1992, but if you pose the headline as the Sun and other newspapers might have an influence, then yes, I think that is how newspapers worked and newspapers influenced elections basically for most of the 20th century. What about now? Looking back at the general election we've just had, one of the main conclusions is that world of Kelvin Mackenzie and that's just gone. That's not the case anymore. We'll still, if you listen to the Today programme, as I do religiously, you'll still hear the kind of review of the papers every morning. But which sort of gives the impression they have the clout that they used to. But once you dig into the figures, newspapers don't at all. Their circulations have crashed over the last 30 years. The Sun was selling 3.5 million in 1992. It's now, well, it's hard to know because the newspapers have stop publishing figures because they're so, but the best estimate is it's under 700,000. Telegraph was over 1 million when I was working for it. Now it's kind of under 300,000. Daily Express was 1.5 million in 1992, according to the figures I've seen. Now it's a tenth of that, which is kind of not much more than the South Wales Echo was kind of selling in the days. So newspapers also own websites, and they publish a lot of it, and increasingly they pay more, and I'll come on to social media in a moment. But in terms of newspaper front pages, newspaper editorials, sort of newspaper editors and owners thinking they can call elections, that world is over. And it's not for want of trying, and my understanding was that the papers like the Sun and the Mail were still, doing their damnedest to look for kind of anti-Labour stories in the run-up to the election campaign and during the campaign. They were all the pro-Conservative papers were basically hammering Labour quite hard on Starmer, the work he'd done as as a human rights lawyer, the people he'd represented, on the tax threat from Labour, culture wars issues. But all of this sort of felt it was like bouncing off the Labour Party, like a kind of ping pong bouncing off a tank. None of it really kind of resonated in the way that it did. And what was particularly galling for those papers, which certainly the Mail and the Telegraph were all in for the Conservative Party at this election. The Sun, which kind of historically likes to be on the winning side, sort of havered for a long time, and then very grudgingly in the kind of the afternoon of the day before polling day, it sort of published a leader saying it was on balance going to support Keir Starmer. Apparently Murdoch had taken the view it was they were going to win, so kind of that's what they should do, but some of the executives in Sun HQ were a bit more twitchy about it, so it was done fairly grudgingly. But basically the readers of the Conservative Party effectively went on voting strike on this. There was polling during the campaign that showed that for the Sun, the Telegraph, the Express, their readers were all more likely to vote Labour than Conservative, despite the sort of torrent of news stories they were reading about how what a disaster a Starmer government was going to be. Only the Mail was the only pro-Conservative paper where readers were still more likely to vote Conservative than Labour, but even then that was 33-26, which kind of sort of is fairly marginal and certainly doesn't reflect their coverage. So the kind of era of I think newspaper editors saying we can shift things is over. But newspaper reporters I think still can make a difference. I talked earlier about the kind of democratic model of journalism, and the idea that we're there to present sort of a fair and neutral facts about politics, and so that sort of you can make up your mind about how to vote. There is another, well, there are plenty of other models of journalism, but another one is the investigative model, and that's quite a different view of how journalism should operate. And rather than say kind of the role of the reporter is to be neutral, it says the role of the reporter is to go out and find bad things and expose them, to stop them. And both, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. They're both kind of valid ways of doing journalism. And in most news organisations, you find some people who do one and some people who do others. Another question to ask is, well, were the kind of investigative reporters having an influence on the general election? The best example during the campaign, I think, was the story about Craig Williams and the Welsh MP who was betting on the election date after before Rishi Sunak had announced it, and who happened to be Rishi Sunak's PPS, which was a kind of great story broken by one of my colleagues, Pippa Carrera. And it made a difference for a bit in that it sort of hogged the headlines, but I don't think sort of even Pippa would say it swayed the election result. But I think there was a story that did affect the election result, and that was the Partygate revelations sort of 2-3 years ago, in that, I mean, if all of that stuff hadn't come out, then those stories directly precipitated the downfall of Boris Johnson, which gave us Liz Truss, and that gave us the mini budget. And at that point, the Labour lead just escalated. And the Conservatives were never able to recover. And it's hard to see Labour winning as big as they did without that initial impetus of the Partygate story. I mean, we're into kind of counterfactuals history now, so you can't really be sure. But if you're looking for an example of revelations, and that again was Pippa, who was working for the Daily Mirror at the time. There were other journalists, Paul Brand from ITV did some very good stories on that too. So it wasn't a single story expose. But without that, I don't think kind of Starmer would have won big in the way that it was. I was trying to think of other similar examples of great sort of investigations or exposés that affected elections, and perhaps Cash for Questions, which started to be associated with the downfall of the Conservatives in the 90s, although that was quite arcane compared to Partygate. And effectively, Cash for Questions was about MPs who were tabling what nowadays would be a Freedom of Information request. But in those days, there was no Freedom of Information Act, so only MPs were allowed to. He was asked questions about Lonro, I think it was. The Iraq WMD story was another one that had a big impact on politics, but it didn't stop Tony Blair winning the 2005 election, and parts of it were wrong anyway, so that wasn't a great example. The expenses expose, I think, was the only other thing that I can think of that really gripped politics in the way that Partygate did, although that affected both parties, so that didn't, I'm not sure that kind of swayed the results of the 2010 election. I'm going to say a bit now about sort of TV and then finish by talking about social media. TV is historically kind of seen as the most influential medium, and what was different about this election compared with 1992 is we now have election debates, but there's no evidence that election debates particularly affected the results. Some of the Nick Robinson interviews on BBC, I think, were pretty impressive. And the one where he exposed what Nigel Farage has said about Putin and Ukraine, that definitely hit the Reform UK vote for a few days. But otherwise, I can't think of television having a big effect. In Westminster, in the kind of lobby where I work, the political editor of the BBC has historically always been seen as the most influential political journalist in the UK. And that's why, the press conference is normally, they're always the first to be called. And Chris Mason and all his predecessors are smart, intelligent, sort of hard-working people. But the point about their influence is they're quite constrained by their impartiality rules. And if they were to go on the kind of news at 10 and start sort of putting their finger on the scales, then they would be hauled off to air quite quickly. So they might have a theoretical power, but it's not a power they can ever really exercise. One of my Jim Waterson, the Guardian's media editor, was writing a sort of piece about influential media during the campaign and concluded that probably the most important journalist sort of in the UK at the moment is the person at the BBC who writes the BBC News Alerts. And no one knows who their name is. There's probably a team of them. But I'm talking about the alerts that will, if you sign up for BBC News Alerts and something happens and 10 million or 15 million people will get something on their phone. And in the era of social media, that is where people are consuming their politics news. And although the news alerts are pretty straight and they get scrutinized very precisely for language, and if you use a term that sort of looks slightly loaded, then the BBC starts getting inundated with complaints. That's kind of one example of why social media now is so important. And the world has transformed since 1992, in the days that I was sort of hoiking around after Neil Kinnock in South Wales, in that most people are consuming most of their news on social media. But trying to work out how that affects politics is really complicated. Because in the old days when you could ask people, were you a Times reader or a Guardian reader or a Sun reader, and you could track how you people voted. It was fairly easy to get data assessing the link between newspaper readership or TV, sort of what TV programs you watched and how you voted. The thing about social media, lots of problems with it. For a start, there's no kind of powerful media barons. There are people who own social media companies, but they don't, if they have a political agenda, they don't say what it was. They all claim they don't have political agendas. They're much more kind of mysterious than the old kind of Robert Maxwell, Rupert Murdoch media tycoon types who wanted everyone to know what their agenda was. Also, it is the media people are consuming is just more multiple and fragmented and diverse. Jim, studying this, worked out most people are now getting most of their media on their phone, and when you ask them what they're reading, he did a report that involved tracking what people were reading, and it's a complete mix. Because some of it will be journalism from companies like the BBC or The Guardian. Some of it will be websites. Some of it will be just social media influencers. People will be watching videos on TikTok or Instagram. It will be a sort of mixture of all of those, trying to kind of fathom out sort of, are you a Guardian reader if you read a bit of Guardian on your phone, but you also kind of follow the football on the Sun, and you kind of like reading a couple of Times columnists? Who knows? I mean, it's really hard to make sense of it. But I'm going to try to draw. There are some conclusions though that you can draw. One is that people have become much more volatile in their media consumption, and that has probably fed through into their politics. If you go back to the 1960s, people pretty much voted for the same political party election after election. I think in the 1960s the figures show from election to election, like 1 person in 10 would switch the party they were voting. In this election we just had, it was 4 people out of 10. So the idea, basically, we're all more promiscuous with our voting, and that probably sort of reflects the media consumption in part. Social media rewards kind of anger and engagement, and there's no better way of getting people to follow you on Twitter than tweeting something that will wind people up, and therefore there's the inherent bias towards the kind of excitable and the emotive rather than the calm and the sensible, and that has probably affected the way sort of campaigning takes place. Most MPs and candidates now will tell you they didn't find the election campaign enjoyable. There was just kind of too much aggro and hassle. And it wasn't the case that the elections were all sweetness and light in the past. And if you read anything about elections in the 50s and 60s, there were kind of fist fights and all the rest of it. But that tended to be people of the same party. I mean, now that aggression is more kind of universalized. Our politics has become more pluralistic, and I think that reflects social media too. For most of the 20th century, we had a kind of 2.5-party system, sort of Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberals, who didn't stand in every constituency for much of the 20th century. Now we had in Britain 5 parties standing everywhere, sort of the not just the Lib Dems, but the Greens and Reform UK, and that is, I think, reflective of a word where media is, you're no longer defined by whether you read right-wing papers or left-wing papers. You're reading social media, and basically everything's on social media, so there's far greater choice. And that has really opened up opportunities for single-issue interest parties, because one of the big developments this election was the election of 6 independent candidates. There was one in Northern Ireland, there was Jeremy Corbyn, and then another 4 who were all sort of elected in constituencies with big Muslim populations campaigning on Gaza. Now, in 1992, if you kind of felt really strongly about the situation in the Middle East was different then because there was a peace process. It probably wasn't as bleak. But if you felt really strongly about something like that, you wouldn't have found much coverage in a national newspaper. You might have, say you were living in kind of Leicester South and you were, your family were in Pakistan and you were really interested in the Middle East or what was happening to Muslims, you would have found it hard to find media that told you, and you'd have probably ended up voting Labour. This time in Leicester South, Labour lost a 20,000 majority because there were people there who were really bothered about Gaza. And if they're reading it on their phones, the phone algorithms will find out that, this is something you're interested in, and before you know it, your phone is nothing but sort of bad news about Gaza. And so no wonder people like that are motivated to say, okay, well, I'll go out as an independent candidate. I feel really strongly about this because I'm being politicized and incentivized by my phone every day. And so basically 4 people got elected on that platform. If you include Jeremy Corbyn, who also has strong views on Gaza, that's 5 Gaza nationalists in part. Plaid have only got 4. So that's something that never happened in the kind of in the old media world at all, but has happened because kind of social media has upended our politics. So I think we're in a world where big stories broken by people, individual journalists working for mainstream media, can still make a difference. But the idea that kind of systematic newspaper bias can swing elections is just not the case anymore, and has gone. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not so sure, and I'll probably run out of time to say. But I'd like to hear what you have to think.
Thank you very much indeed. I just sort of ask one thing before we throw it open. I mean, it seems you're saying that the newspapers were maybe 20% influential, but slightly influential, and the politicians certainly were very craven in the face of Murdoch and Maxwell and people like that. And then TV, you said probably the most important medium, is very heavily regulated, although GB News is now apparently unregulated. It's obviously biased, and yet it's allowed to broadcast. And yet there's no regulation at all of social media, which is, as you just said, incredibly important. I mean, do you think that is something that is coming, that the politicians will try and control this very, very important medium?
Well, it's hard to see how. It's too late to close the internet. The debate about social media and children I find really interesting, and that's not particularly a media issue. That's an educational issue. But increasingly now there are reports of schools that are trying to stop pupils sort of having smartphones because it's bad for their development, and bad for their education, bad for their learning. I think we'll see more of that. But on the wider point about regulating the internet for content, I would like to, if someone could find out a way of doing it, I would like to see it done. I mean, I'm still amazed that companies that have the ability to kind of more or less predict what I find my phone can work out what I've just been reading or kind of where I'm sitting, and yet they don't have the ability to stop people sort of swearing at each other or threatening to kill each other in anonymous posts on Twitter. I don't believe they don't have the capacity, and I'm surprised that government hasn't done more. Yeah. But it's not easy.
It's a big coming issue. Yeah. Okay. Let's open it up. Yeah. There's a question over here.
Hi, thanks very much for that. I found it very, very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
So you work for the Telegraph, and then you go working for the Guardian, and you mentioned that the press...
it's worse than that. I worked for the Daily Mail for a few years.
Well, there we go, yeah. So the press follow public opinion rather than create it. And do you think your journalism in the Guardian is completely honest, or when you write up a story, do you put a different... It won't be the same reporters, I wouldn't understand, that you do for the Telegraph.
People often assume that the reporters always identify with the politics of the newspaper they work for, and that is not always the case. And when I worked for the Telegraph, I mean, that was in the Conrad Black era where Charles Moore was editor, and the Telegraph in those days sort of prided itself on running quite straight news coverage. The editorial columns were very Eurosceptic and right wing, but the news was generally straight, and the newsroom was full of people who voted Labour, and frankly, sort of no one was that bothered about your politics. So there are kind of Labour voters who work for right-wing papers. There probably aren't many kind of Conservative voters at the at the Guardian, but there are left-wing, there are Corbynistas, and there are Starmerites, and there are Blairites, and there are Liberals, and there are Greens, and we're a wide group. When I worked for the Mail, there was a clear editorial line, and journalists were expected to write to the when I worked there, I never felt that I was writing anything that was factually untrue, but I was writing to stories with a slant or a perspective that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen myself and wouldn't always have been described as fair. And I'm much more comfortable working for The Guardian. I've never come under pressure at The Guardian to write stories in a particular way, but my sense is if I were to start writing stories about how wonderful Donald Trump and Nigel Farage were, then sort of some point before too long, then people might realise that this wasn't really what the readers wanted and suggest that maybe I might be better employed doing the gardening column or something like that. So, but I've never. I think The Guardian is a very honest paper, and it's quite scrupulous about facts, but we write for an audience who are interested in certain things, and historically we've been a kind of liberal progressive paper, and we see ourselves as championing causes that aren't championed by other people, and in our editorial positions we kind of historically we tended to favour Labour. We did this election in the past, we sometimes sort of backed Liberals, so if you can look at the paper from that point of view, you might think it's a left-wing paper trying to persuade you of left-wing views. My a benchmark with journalism is always, is it fair? I mean, if I don't mind taking a view on a subject if I am confident that I can turn around to the reader and say, that's fair, that's the facts are accurate, and if I've made a value judgment in there, it's a value judgment that I can defend because I think it's fair. So read it, try it. Hopefully you'll like it. And
okay.
what is there anything that you don't think is fair, or is there anything that? Yeah. 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 Okay. That's.
Okay.
Andrew, thank you very much for fantastic talk there. One of the things that strikes me is that we understand that the people that actually decide they want to vote has been decreasing over the years, there's a sort of correlation with the reduction in the number of people that take newspapers, but maybe that's not that's just something. But why do you think? Do you think they're just not engaged because political journalism isn't getting their scruff of their neck, or what is it?
I think that's a really good question, and no one fully knows the answer. And it became after the big fall in electoral turnout was between 1997 and 2001, where it hit its historic low. It was 59%. I think this election was marginally above the 2001. And after 2001, all sorts of think tanks started looking into this. And the best explanation I saw. Oh, sorry, is it Yvette? Can you go out with Mum?
No, I'm trying to take her out.
Yeah.
enough politics.
Yeah, sorry, that's my daughter who's autistic and not very interested, probably a bit hungry and not very interested in politics. They looked at all sorts of, was it sort of content? Was it the fact that people were really happy? Was it the fact that they thought it was too difficult to vote? Was it sort of the trust in politics had declined? And there was sort of evidence for all of that. I think the best explanation they came out with was that the parties were kind of a bit too similar and people were broadly quite happy and things were, there were no great grievances in 2001. The economy was doing quite well, the election was okay, people just had other things to do. I think the sense of sort of civic voting as a civic duty has declined. I think definitely kind of respect for institutions has declined. The fact that this government made it slightly harder to vote than it was probably hasn't helped, although I don't think that's the main factor at all. I wish I had a good answer to that.
My follow-up was, would you have more traction if everybody had to vote?
I'm not sure. I think there are a couple of changes you could make to increase turnout. One would be, what we don't have is the compulsory registration to vote. The turnout figures that you read are the turnout as a proportion of people who are registered to vote. Mm-hmm. But to register to vote, you have to make an effort, and it would be relatively simple for the state, which has the tax office, the national insurance, the NHS. There are lots of government bodies that know who you are, know how old you are, know where you live, and could quite easily put you on the electoral register without you having to sign it. And if the Labour government's talking about doing that, and it seems a kind of thoroughly good idea. Compulsory voting is slightly more complicated because do you really want to fine people for not doing that? And maybe you'll just aggravate people even more. I wouldn't particularly have a problem with it. I'm not sure it would necessarily make a kind of big difference. Would it be better for journalism? I'd like to think it would, but one of the problems with news at the moment is increasingly people are avoiding news because it makes them depressed. And, but people who read my blog do so because they're really interested in politics, but you can't force people to read political news if they don't want to, much as great as it would be for my job and my profession and Guardian revenues, which need sort of all the help they can get. But I can't see that as a runner, I'm afraid.
Hello, thank you very much for that. I'm over here.
Oh.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on the sort of burgeoning role of podcasts, news podcasts, where you've got sort of well-known political commentators from fairly well-known backgrounds commenting and talking about their personal and they're sort of talking more personally. They're less sort of hidebound by the strictures of working for the BBC or working for a particular newspaper. And they seem to be growing. There are lots of well-known broadcasters, Peston, Pippa Carrera, Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart. There are legions of them. So I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on podcasts and where they might take us, please.
I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and I kind of think for me, it was the BBC's Brexit cast that was the first political podcast that I started engaging with, and I suddenly realised that actually I felt I was getting a kind of a better and deeper account of what was going on in the kind of Brexit talks than I was in the normal BBC news bulletins. And the fact, it was around the time that I started doing my sort of politics blog in about 2009, 2010, and one of my background had been in newspapers, but now I do the blog. And one of the reasons I enjoy doing that as a form of journalism was I get the sense that I can spread my elbows more easily and say things that you couldn't do in news journalism, and be a bit more personal and be a bit more discursive and be a bit more funny. And podcasts was broadcasters doing the same thing, and I think there is a really strong appetite from kind of audiences for kind of they want journalism with a bit of character and a bit of flavour. Always had a strong sense working in newsrooms, and I remember particularly when I joined the lobby, that the conversation in the newsroom was much more interesting than the journalism we were producing.
Yes,
And
yeah.
particularly, I'd sit there in, I think of the kind of Telegraph in the days when I was working there, it was a very, Telegraph's become more kind of Daily Mailish now, but in the days when I was there, it was straight, but sort of, not always the most kind of like, exciting. It was reliably solid, and yet in the newsroom, we'd have kind of really interesting conversations with my colleagues about why they're doing that, what's the real motive for that, will it work? And I thought, can't we just share some of that with readers? And that's sort of what I try to do with the blog. That's definitely what podcasts do. And I agree. I listen to them a lot. I like The Rest Is Politics, I think, is probably the biggest sort of political franchise at the moment. Quite how much influence they've got, I'm not so sure, because I think I'm not sure they're winning people over, but they're certainly making, they're presenting a lot of money. They're producing good content. I also think I would put in a word as well for increasingly lots of journalists are doing Substack accounts, which is basically they're setting up their own paid-for blogs on Substack, which is a forum, and basically, if you're any journalist who now gets redundant, who's got a sort of speciality, seems to be setting up as a sub, and you can set it up so you can either be free or you have a subscription of like £3 a month or £10 a month or something. And some people are starting to earn quite good money from doing really detailed, long form. The Sam Friedman is the one that I read the most, but there are other really good politics ones too. So I'm a big fan.
It's an interesting thing in Pakistan, where I spend a lot of time. The journalists there who get fired because they're out of favour with the government are now going onto YouTube. They don't really do Substack, but they do YouTube and TikTok and whatever. And the one that makes money is YouTube. And they can just, a prominent national level journalist who's been fired for being too anti-system will make a living on YouTube, just doing 15 minutes a day of his views on what's going on. So it's a sort of equivalent to the Substack thing. And just could you explain your blog? Because, I mean, Andy basically pioneered this, which has become a national trend. So you start at what time? How often do you file? How does it work?
The blog is a online journalism reporting the news from Westminster as it happens, and I kind of start at about 8-9 o'clock in the morning and go on until 6. But if there's something happening late, and it's a mix of kind of minute by minute. I try and blogs work best with news events happening in real time. So kind of debates, speeches, press conference, votes. What they're not good at is kind of investigating sort of scandal behind the scenes. But if you are, or on election night, they're brilliant because it's like watching a kind of rolling. It's the online equivalent of rolling news, but with this my blog is a reporting blog rather than a comment blog, but because it's a blog, there is the scope to do sort of instant comment analysis, explanation, jokes, links, sort of referencing other things. It's a hodgepodge of what I think people will find interesting at the time, and I tend to focus on whatever the main stories of the day are, but if something changes, you can very, very quickly change the headline and change your focus. And if it's announced that so-and-so's been resigned, then immediately we can start writing about that. So that's what, and you'll find it on the kind of front page of the Guardian website pretty much every day, sort of normally quite prominent and very prominent if the politics news is the best story of the day.
There's a question over there.
Thank you so much, and your commentary has been very insightful. If you were giving this talk in the US in a golf club about this time of year, given that we have, I'd say, 3 national television networks and probably 2 or 3 nationally read newspapers being the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and perhaps Washington Post, would your commentary be the same, or would you have different things to say about the influence of journalism and social media on politics?
Well, I think the media landscape is completely different there, and what I described as the kind of democratic model of journalism sort of works over here because we got the BBC and regulated TV media, and so even though we have newspapers that are partisan and not particularly heavily regulated, there has always been a sort of reasonably good source of reasonably neutral, reasonably accurate news in the UK, and which was widely kind of certainly until quite recently was and sort of widely was the dominant news. Well, certainly trusted, is still trusted, but what I mean was the dominant news provider for most people. Since you've had Fox in the.
Oh, I didn't add Fox because that.
Well, but what I mean is, in the States, it seems to me you've got completely two media, two worlds of media consumers who kind of don't overlap at all. The CNN crowd and the Fox crowd, and they have very little common ground and very little agreed narrative or agreed facts. So I think politically that creates kind of real problems for America as a polity. I mean, if you have a citizenship who can't agree on the facts, then how can you make kind of wise democratic decisions? Is that fair, or is that sort of?
No, I think that's fair, and I think also in the U.S., papers certainly announce their endorsement of candidates through the primaries, and also in the lead up to the election, newspapers will publicly say who they're endorsing. I'm
not sure I'd be interested. I don't have figures to back this up, so I might be completely wrong. But my sense is that in the British market, newspapers probably had more clout than American, because in the UK you have a national newspaper market, right, which is all to do with the emergence of kind of mass media newspapers coinciding with the introduction of rail throughout the country. So you could print a paper in London at 2:00 in the morning and sell it throughout the United Kingdom the next morning because we were the right size. But you can't do that in the States because the States is too big. So you don't have that same kind of national newspaper market. You could do it now because you'd satellite things, but 100 years ago when newspapers were just taking off, they didn't have satellite printing. So that wasn't an option. So you've got a market where you've got a couple of 2 or 3 really big, the Washington Post and the New York Times and Wall Street Journal perhaps, and then basically kind of a much more regional newspaper market, and where we had a saturated, really competitive national newspaper market with kind of 11, 12 daily titles, all fighting for the same money from the same readers.
That is one of my essay topics. You just got an A. Yeah.
Oh right, okay. That's glad to learn I'll pass something. So.
Thanks, Andy. Fascinating talk. Do you think, just pursuing a theme you raised before, that one of the problems of the declining readership in printed journalism is the lack of fun and humour in the headline writing? I'm going back a bit, when George Michael was caught in flagrante, the wonderful headline, I don't know whether it was the Star or the Sun, but the one I wish I'd written was, "Zip me up before you go." And these days I'm guessing that editors would probably not allow that sort of headline to go through, but we all laughed and we all enjoyed it then, and the circulation figures of the respective newspapers then were a lot higher than they are now.
I think if you read the tabloid papers, you would still find headlines like that. I mean, I can't give you as good an example as that one, but and they still employ really clever, creative sub-editors. There fewer than they did, but I think I don't think that's the reason why. I don't think the quality and a decline in the quality of the product is why people have stopped reading papers. I think it's to do with sort of better and cheaper and alternatives on your phone, I'm afraid.
Yep.
Hi. Great talk, and I'm really glad that the question of the difference between the UK and the States came up, because that was actually what I was going to talk about. In that you had this sense that, and I think this is quite a general sense that everyone has, that the democratic model of journalism works better in the UK than it does in the States because of that bifurcation you're talking about, and because how horrible things like Fox News look to us. But I want to push back on that a little bit. When you think systemically, like, yes, we have these right-wing papers, but like they are all owned by News Corp. And when you look at like the history of this, since the 80s, we have not elected a prime minister who was not endorsed by the Murdoch press, and that simply isn't the case over there. Elections are less sort of like you can't predict them in that way, whereas you can over here. Surely he's probably being more strategic in who he chooses to endorse over here, maybe. But like at the same time, in that period, we have consistently, whenever we've elected a Labour government, it's been a notably right-wing one. So I would like to push back on this notion that even in those days that the democratic model of journalism was completely functional over here. I think we actually have quite a particularly bad relationship between the press and government.
I think I'm not sure I said it was perfect. I think I'm just trying to think whether Murdoch could probably endorse every president who's won since. Right. And I'm not. I don't think them. I think from Labour's point of view, it was more convenient having a kind of a Sun endorsement than not, but I don't think they were that bothered, and I really don't think it made any difference this time round. And it was
Starmer didn't bother this time.
But,
did he?
yeah. Yeah. And I also on Leveson too. My colleague Owen Jones was tweeting about this yesterday because Byline Times wrote a story basically saying that was the condition for the Murdoch support, and I'm prepared to believe there was a meeting where Leveson 2 was raised, and Starmer said, "Well, frankly, I'm not that bothered about it," and Rebecca Brooks at that point said, "Okay, we'll endorse you." What I don't think is that Starmer had any real interest in doing Leveson 2 anyway, because he's got. He's got an agenda. Since he's been Labour leader, he's never shown any huge interest in sort of re-regulating the press or tightening press regulation. Some respects, it'd be nice if he did, but he's got. If you've got an agenda that you want to do in 5 years, do you want to pick a fight? I mean, it's like poking a scorpion's nest. It's picking a fight with News UK. It's something you only do if you're really strongly motivated, and he isn't. So I don't think that was ever going to happen anyway.
My mum says so. I'm my best behaviour. So I'll
no, go on. I don't know. I think Britain would be a healthier place if we had never had Murdoch and we didn't have these big newspaper ownership. But my argument tonight is that they are less. They don't have the clout that they did, and that world is over.
But I would like to suggest that Starmer preempting which issues he's going to be soft on before the press responds is in itself surely some sort of influence from the press.
necessarily. I mean, I think you...
Like systemically? Like he's operating under that understanding?
He's...
Sorry.
Yeah, I just disagree. I think he's got an agenda, and he kind of knows the old Bean Up pal saying about the press is like politicians complaining about the press is like kind of sailors complaining about the sea. I mean, you just have to live with it. I don't think he particularly likes the right-wing papers, but he certainly doesn't. He didn't court Murdoch in the way that he's been more standoffish with Murdoch than Tony Blair was. Tony Blair and I was on the Blair battle bus in 1997 for the Mail, so I kind of saw him quite close. Blair had this belief that he could win round anyone to anything, and Starmer's not that naive. Blair could win round a lot of people to a lot of things, but he kind of wasn't as persuasive as sometimes he thought he was. Whereas I think Starmer's got these. I mean, prosecuted News International. He kind of knows what. I'm sure he's got views on Rebecca, the equivalent of Rebecca Books that kind of he won't be sharing in public. So I don't think he's got any illusions about these people, but he's got. It's a lot easier to govern, even if he might not share my thesis. My thesis is that they don't have the clout that they did. If I might be wrong, but if he doesn't share that, he will take the view that it's a lot easier to govern if you kind of don't have these people sort of on your back the whole time over phone hacking, which was kind of 20 years ago when you're trying to bring down NHS waiting lists. So government's about prioritising, and that's the fight that he wants to have.
There's a question here.
Yeah, hi, Andrew. It's good that we've got two microphones now, isn't it? Of course, media has an influence on politics. Media, I think, has an influence, and I say media because in the broad sense, perhaps not so much in the print sense now, but in the broad sense, of course, media has an influence on politics and everything else, really. Even you referred to sport, where a journalist will report on the game, but it's how you tell it, isn't it? It's how you tell the stories, and he can't influence that game, but he can influence the next game. And I'm thinking of the Euros now. If you slag off an English football team, that's going to affect the way they perform in the next round.
I will do. My expertise at football is fairly limited.
Me too. me too.
Yeah. So I will happily to defer to pretty much everyone in the room on that. But still, I think the point I was making about that was that even if the press write about the football manager has some sort of influence, it's kind of nothing compared to the kind of make or break prime minister's influence that newspapers used to think they could exercise.
Yeah, what I'm saying is just it's the way you tell them.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps, in Russia they will report a story, but it will not be perhaps the way you might report that story.
Yeah, no, and that's why fairness is my benchmark.
So I think that's where its influence is, and mainly it's the people who believe that whatever it is, and it's just reinforcing their belief most of the time, I think.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And having kind of worked in tabloid papers, I say I know the instances of newspapers making things up is fairly rare in my experience. I mean, it doesn't, but you can construct and there's a reason that they get called stories, not reports. And it's because people want narrative. And when I worked for the Mail, it was fairly clear stories had to have a goodie and a baddie, and it wasn't always party political. And the Mail had its own kind of agenda that didn't particularly align with, or didn't always align with party politics, but it had to do with kind of who were the goodies and the baddies in the Daily Mail's worldview, and stories got sort of written in a way that conformed to that, in a way, and it was rare that you could point to anything and say, well, that was factually wrong, but they involved making value judgments that weren't always sort of objective or neutral or fair.
We'll just take 2 or 3 more, and there's one here. Yeah.
Thank you. I had the the experience 2 days after the election of having a conversation with someone who had just finished her work as a special advisor to a very senior government minister. And I was quite shocked at how right-wing she was. She'd like to have been a Conservative candidate, but unless you were, in her mind, very left-wing, over the last 5 years, you didn't have a chance of becoming a candidate. Rishi Sunak was a socialist, and her views on Muslim immigration just don't, I wouldn't, state. But, so that may have left me wondering what the future is of the Conservative Party. I just wonder what your view would be on the future of the Conservative. Where do they go now? Because there's clearly a big division.
If they go in that direction, then I think the Reform UK direction, I think they're lost. I'm not sure they will. I think at the start of the campaign, Nigel Farage has clearly got, and he's kind of talked quite openly about this, that his belief that one day he and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Suella Braverman will all end up in the same party because there is a sort of natural constituency for that sort of politics. And I think at the start of the campaign, the idea that there might be some eventual realignment was sort of credible. I think once the Conservative Party took a look at quite how many kind of racist candidates were attracted to Reform UK like a magnet, quite how off the wall their manifesto was, then pretty much all the contenders apart from Suella Braverman have stood back and said, well, actually, we don't want Farage in the party, we don't want to align with them. I think they will pull back from that. I think they will probably be irrelevant for a few years. I think the person who wins this election contest won't be the next Conservative Prime Minister. I don't think they will go in that direction because Reform UK have sort of got it. They've marked out that territory, and there isn't under kind of first past the post. You can't create an election-winning coalition on that sort of politics. I mean, unless the world changes completely and sort of there's war with Russia and kind of an energy shock and something really dire happens. I can't see it that happening.
Thank you. We're going to do 3 questions at once. So there's one here, yes. And then next to you.
Just a very quick one. One point I'd just like to make was you talk about the effect of television on elections. I think the entire world is looking for the television interview debate between Trump and Biden's replacement, and I think the entire world is awaiting that one because it can't go any worse, can it really? But the point I really wanted to make was I think talking about social media and the fact that we have more contact with our MPs and things these days. I've followed my MP since he was last elected to see what he does locally and in Parliament, and I've had emails from him every week and fascinated with what he's been doing. He's actually moved to another area, but my other MP, we've now gone to serve Labour. I will follow my new MP to see what he's doing locally and speak to a lot of my friends in different areas. A lot of us are voting more on what our local MP is doing because we now know what our local MP is doing. Through social media, whereas before we just voted for the party. And I think, speaking generally, I think a lot more people are more focused on local issues and more likely to vote if more people follow what their local MPs and candidates were doing. I think that's really important.
Oh, well, historically, Anglesy's always voted with the candidate rather than the party. That's right. And here we are. No. Yep. Yep.
He is actually my husband, but never mind. Just really going back to the sort of journalism approach generally, do you think we are going to get towards proportional representation? Obviously, Reform UK felt that they should have had far more seats than they eventually ended up with because of first past the post. And if we do move towards proportional representation, how is that going to affect media, and you're not going to be able to choose one side versus another necessarily. Your thoughts?
I think this election's interesting. I think the Lib Dems got their correct proportional amount for the first time ever with 70, which did actually reflect their national vote share. And as one more, yeah.
Sorry, was there an answer?
Oh, I'm good. I think
we're
we're taking three at once. Yeah. So yeah.
3 questions. Yeah.
Okay. My question is the media biased by the items it ignores? For example, there was a recent protest where there was a collective chain around the Westminster estate by pro-Palestinians, and it was not visible anywhere on the BBC.
Taking them in reverse order. I think that's not covering something is the one of the primary ways in which the media does slant the news, and there are lots of issues that don't get as much coverage as they probably should. Sometimes it's because there's I've got, as you'll have seen it, I've got a special needs daughter. Special needs issues don't get covered very much. But that's also partly because readers who don't have special needs interests aren't that interested. Don't want to do that, and eventually media organisations are driven by what the audience want, or not entirely, but at least in part. Climate change is another one, which is still getting it gets quite a lot of media coverage, but probably not as much as it deserves when you kind of assess the scale of the threat. The wipeout of human civilization in the next 200 years. That's quite a big story, and that basically any expert who's kind of looked at that will tell you that's something. Gaza, and I think Gaza has had a lot of coverage, but probably the people who say there isn't as much focus as on the suffering of the population in Gaza as in other conflicts. I think probably have a point, but it varies from media to media. Generally, although protests, there are quite a lot of protests that don't get covered, partly because it's protests are picture events, right? They don't work they don't work as stories for newspapers. They are photo events, and some news organisations take the view if you're covering protests like that, you're encouraging civil disruption, that you're rewarding bad behaviour. Basically, that's not a Guardian view, but that would be the view in some news organisations. Coming to your point about PR, I think we'd be better off with a system of PR. I think we'd have permanent coalitions. I think politicians would learn not to demonise each other, but to cooperate with each other and to compromise. Generally, we'd have a sort of better, healthier political culture. In terms of what that would mean for reporters, we'd probably have to sort of mug up more on Green Party politics and policies and Liberal Democrat policies. Although, in Scotland and in Wales, where they've been covering coalition governments, I'm not sure that made a big difference to media coverage. And in London, we had a coalition for 5 years, and that didn't really that didn't sanitise or transform or sort of convert the newspaper industry to benefits of pluralism and cooperation and the Hont system. Whether I don't think we'll get it. Keir Starmer seems to have, just as he has no interest in regulating the media, he's got never. 20 years ago, he co-wrote a book that made the case for PR, but I'm not sure he wrote the chapter on that. Certainly as Labour leader, he's shown no interest. The people around him, Morgan McSweeney and the kind of Labour fixers, they are even more sort of anti-PR than he is. They kind of, some of the people from that wing of the kind of Labour right kind of viscerally loathe the Liberal Democrats and kind of, and they've got a majority of basically a working majority of 180, and it's quite hard to make the case for PR there. if they eventually do House of Lords reform, you'll get a PR system for that. So I don't think, I'd like to see that happen, but I don't think it will. Coming to the point about social media, I agree, and I think if I gave the impression that the social media has been an unmitigated disaster, that is not what I intended, because I think there are kind of lots of areas where kind of social media or different sorts of media have been really good. For someone like myself who's really interested in politics, the ability now to follow politics in detail, to have conversations with kind of legal experts or sort of constitutional experts on Twitter and other social media avenues that just wasn't available in the world where of newspapers is terrific. I feel much more enlightened as a consumer of political news because of what's available via social media than I did in the print world. But for all the good stuff, there's a lot of kind of hate and nonsense and lies and sort of rubbish out there, and it's having really negative effects on our politics as well as some good ones.
So, thank you very much to Andrew Sparrow. I'm sorry your daughter was not interested. We all were. So thank you very much for coming all this way and telling us about what you do and those relationships between the journalists and the politicians and journalism and politics. So thank you very much indeed for coming.
Well, thank you. Yes. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and the questions are great, and it's really enjoyable talking to an engaged audience. So thank you very much.
So thanks very much for everybody's great contributions. Food.